Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Release of the Canada in a Changing Climate National Issues Report. This webinar is presented by Canada's Climate Change Adaptation Platform. My name is Suzanne Sealing and I'm the Adaptation Extension Liaison at the Climate Risk Institute. Today I will act as your technical support. If you run into audio or technical issues during the webinar, please send me an email at suzanne.sealing@climateriskinstitute.ca and I will help you to the best of my abilities. I have posted my email address in the chat box. There's a dedicated panel discussion today where we will address any questions. You are welcome to type out your questions into the Q&A box in your official language of choice throughout the webinar. Please note that your microphones have been automatically muted to avoid any audio distractions or feedback during the webinar. We are recording the webinar today and we'll be sending out a link to everyone who has registered. And with that, I will pass it over to Rory Gilsonen. Just one second. Okay, go ahead, Rory, you should be on now. Fiona, we might have lost Rory. Oh, there he is.
Hear me now.
There you are. Hi, welcome.
I got kicked out into cyberspace and then welcome back in again. So thank you for that.
Okay.
But I am here. So this is exciting. Welcome everybody. Bienvenue à tous et à toutes à la publication du Canada dans un climat changeant. Welcome everybody to Canada in a Changing Climate. Je suis Rory Gilsonen, Director Général à Ressources Naturelles Canada. I'm the Director General who oversees the production of this report and the series of the reports. To get us kicked off, I would like to acknowledge that those of us here in Ottawa are located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, home to Algonquin, Huron, Wyandot, Mohawk, Anishinaabe, and St. Lawrence Iroquois people. This territory is part of the Treaty of the Crawford Purchase of 1783. As you all know, June marks National Indigenous History Month. It's an opportunity for us to recommit to deepening our understanding of Indigenous peoples' histories, governments, customs, traditions, and languages, and continue to advance reconciliation and nation-to-nation collaboration. Keeping the names of these territories alive is a form of respect and a small act of decolonization to preserve land, culture, and traditions of Indigenous people here in Canada. So you're likely here because you already know that Canada is warming at twice the global average rate, and in Canada's north, 3 times that rate. You know that we're already living with the impacts of climate change. These impacts are growing, and we anticipate that they will continue to grow even as we take strong action to reduce emissions and limit the extent. And that the science tells us that many of these changes are irreversible. So adaptation is essential. Canada in a Changing Climate, Advancing Our Knowledge for Action is a series of reports that tells us how and why Canada's climate is changing, what those changes mean for our communities, our economy, and our environment, and what are we doing to adapt. The National Issues Report is the second report in the series. It focuses on issues of national importance, impacts on key economic sectors, or on ecosystem services, or issues that are best understood from a national perspective, such as the particular combination of impacts facing cities and towns all across this country. Assessment reports provide value-added analysis of risks and opportunities to inform decision-making while remaining policy neutral. And they take a whole of system approach that explores linkages and provides new insights to Canadians. In short, they strengthen our ability to take action, to use what we know to adapt for the changes that we see now and those that we anticipate that will happen over the coming years. The National Issues Report is the work of over 200 authors, advisors, and reviewers from many different groups. These people have contributed their time, energy, and expertise out of their commitment to the issue and their belief that we will all make better decisions to combat the impacts of climate change if we have the necessary knowledge available in an accessible, usable form. I'd like to take a moment to thank them for their efforts and commend them for their exceptional work that they have done. I know that many of you here on this call have contributed into the process in one way or another, and we have the lead authors and many of the authors around the table today. The report is particularly timely in that Canada has committed to the development of its first national adaptation strategy. The development of what we refer to as the NAS is still in its early stages, and the knowledge in this report will really help us frame the discussions moving forward that we will need to have over the coming months. A further step in turning knowledge into action, which is really the theme of this report. In a moment, I'll turn to Fiona Warren, who you've already seen on the screen, and the panel of authors who will speak to the report's content chapter by chapter. But before I do, I would like to thank Fiona for her leadership on this report and on the assessment process as a whole. NRCan has been leading this assessment process since the early 2000s, so yes, for about 2 decades now. And Fiona and her team, including Nikki Lillum, Deanne Dupuis, Joanne Egan, and Julia Schwartz, have maintained the high standard of past reports while also finding ways to make the information they contain more accessible, more usable, and more available to those who need it. So congrats to the team. Thank you everyone once again for your contribution. And as much as anyone, I'm excited and look forward to this webinar and look forward to any feedback or comments that you have afterwards. So with that, I'll turn it over to Fiona. Fiona, please.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Rory, for your introduction and your kind words. And as you said, we've had an amazing team of people contributing within the Secretariat, the advisors, the authors, the reviewers. It's been such an honor and privilege to work with all these people over the years, and I am so excited today to be sharing the report and its release. And thank you to everyone on the line. It looks like we have about 360 people. So pleased that you could join us today on this sunny day in the summer to help us mark the release. Oops. Okay. Remember not to use my mouse to advance. Suzanne, my slide is not advancing. Is there a fix for that? Oh, there we go. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, thanks very much. So today I'm going to start with a little bit of context on the assessment process, but most of the discussion will be around the key findings of the National Issues Report. I'll also introduce you to our website, changingclimate.ca, then provide a brief conclusion. After that, I'm going to pass it over to a member of our advisory committee, Eva Jackson, and she's going to lead a panel discussion with the lead authors of the chapters. And I'll just remind you again to please enter your questions into the Q&A box as we go so that we can be ready to start the panel discussion as soon as I finish up my presentation. So as Rory said, we've been working on science assessments at NRCan since the early to mid 2000s. Our current process, Canada in a Changing Climate, Advancing Our Knowledge for Action, was launched at the end of 2016 with a scoping meeting. And in this process, we're releasing a total of 6 reports. The first report was Canada's Changing Climate Report. That one looked at how and why the climate is changing in Canada, looked at things like changes in temperature, precipitation, sea level, glaciers, permafrost, water levels. And what that report really did was provide the climate foundation to inform the remaining reports, which are all focused on climate change impacts and adaptation. So today I'll be providing more detail on the National Issues Report. And we also, within NRCan, are leading our Regional Perspectives Report. That one has 6 regional chapters. The first of those chapters was the Prairie Provinces, and we released that in December 2020. And the remaining 5 chapters will be released over the fall and the winter months. Also exciting to note that we have a separate report, which is being led by Health Canada on the health of Canadians in a changing climate. And we expect that report out in the fall. And then in 2022, we have a report led by Indigenous academics and leaders on Indigenous resilience. And there will also be an enhanced synthesis, which will pull together all the results from the other reports at the end. And just a quick note too, as I don't have one slide that I normally have in terms of what assessments are. And what they do is they synthesize the existing knowledge. So they don't present new research, they're not policy prescriptive, but they are really designed to inform adaptation decision-making. All of these reports will be available at the same website, and that's at changingclimate.ca. We're very excited about that too, because it really provides people with one place to go for a wealth of information. So as Rory mentioned, over 200 experts alone contributed to the National Issues Report. In the process as a whole, it's probably double that. So these people participate throughout the process in different roles. We have 20 advisory committee members who represent primarily the users of the assessment, and they've been with us since the beginning. An amazing group who provided advice, ideas, and recommendations to help us guide the process. For the National Issues Report, we have 12 coordinating lead authors, many of whom are with us today. So they are responsible for scoping their chapter, drafting the chapters, delivering the final one, and building the writing teams. This involves engaging contributing authors. This report had 65, and these people contributed to sections of the chapters as well as the case stories. Also important is the review process. In order to ensure that our reports are credible, that they're relevant and actually useful for the users, we put a strong focus on the expert review process. In this case, 106 people contributed to this, and they just help ensure the chapters serve their goals essentially. So quick thank you again to everyone who's participating today who has contributed in some way to this report. So now to the report itself. So when we released Canada's Changing Climate Report in 2019, I think I forgot to mention that report was co-led with Environment and Climate Change Canada. But the #1 question we heard was, well, what do these changes in climate actually mean? What do they mean for me? What do they mean for the people living in Canada right now? And that's what this report really addresses. It looks at topics that are either of national importance or that are best understood through an integrated pan-Canadian perspective. There's also a strong focus on adaptation within the report. So it answers the question, like, how can we adapt to reduce the risks that we're seeing from climate change now and in the future? How can we reduce the costs, which are rising substantially? And how can we take advantage of potential opportunities as well? The report looks at where we've made progress on addressing the climate change impacts and adaptation issues. As I said, we've been leading these assessment reports since the mid-2000s. And it also looks at where do the gaps in knowledge and action remain and what the key emerging issues are in order to help inform future programs and policies and action. So there are a total of 9 chapters in the report, and I'm happy to say that we have an author or 2 available for each of these chapters to answer your questions during the panel session. You'll see that they focus on social themes, such as cities and towns and rural and remote communities, environmental themes, including water resources and ecosystem services, and economic themes. So we have a specific chapter that looks at the costs and benefits of climate change impacts and adaptation. We have a chapter that looks at the sector impacts. These are primarily economic sectors, such as energy, forestry, tourism, transportation, mining, agriculture. We also have 2 additional chapters that represent an exciting new contribution to the assessment process. We have one that focuses on climate disclosure, litigation, and finance, and another that looks at the international dimensions. Because in order to really understand the impacts of climate change on Canada, we need to look beyond our borders. We need to look at what's happening in other countries with respect to the impacts, but also in terms of the adaptation decisions that they're making. So now I'm going to go through the key findings of the report. These key findings are from the overview chapter. There's 6 of them in total. So The first key finding is that communities of all sizes, so from the small, rural, and remote communities to the large cities, towns, and urban centers, they are all already experiencing the impacts of climate change on their infrastructure, their health and well-being, their cultures, and economies. In terms of the impacts on infrastructure, we see it's especially a concern with respect to extreme events. They represent a key risk. This is especially true as in many areas of Canada, the infrastructure is aging and not designed for the changing climate or sometimes the current demands on the systems. In terms of service delivery, this is especially important when you consider that many rural communities have limited access routes. An example of this that was highlighted within the sector impacts chapter is that in 2017 and 2018, in Churchill, Manitoba, the rail line was forced to close due to issues with permafrost thaw and flooding. This meant that service was limited, including access to services such as medical service, and prices skyrocketed for goods. We also found that the losses are both measurable, and we can all relate quite easily to the economic costs. We see the numbers in the media all the time, but they're also intangible. This refers to impacts such as the loss of identity, the loss of culture, and sense of place. It's also clear that the impacts are being felt unequally across society. In the words of one of the key messages from the Cities and Towns chapter, it appears as if often people who are struggling the most are being hit the hardest by climate change. And this really emphasizes the importance of putting the social equity lens on our adaptation decisions. The second key finding finds that changes in climate, so the changes we're seeing now, are threatening the vital services that ecosystems provide to Canada and are also negatively impacting our water resources. So in recent years, ecosystem services have been receiving increasing attention, and these refer to things like food provision, clean air and water, climate regulation, recreation opportunities, and the list go on. So what the ecosystem services chapter found is that many of these services are being threatened by extreme events, such as wildfire, for example, which can affect things like carbon sequestration, water quality, timber supply, but also by shifts in seasonal patterns. It's also clear that climate change is making problems of water availability and quality worse and changing the nature and timing of floods and droughts. We see this quite clearly in the trends in terms of the rising losses from floods over recent years. It's also clear, however, that ecosystems are a very important part of the solution. We find that nature-based approaches to adaptation consider adaptation activities like building or salt marshes to reduce the impacts of sea level rise in coastal communities, or the use of urban forests in cities to reduce the impacts of extreme heat. I find that in many cases, they are the most cost-effective solution. They are socially acceptable, and they bring a range of co-benefits, which are important to consider. It's also clear that while climate change will bring some potential benefits to Canada, overall, it'll impose increasing economic costs. And we see this from the graph on the screen, that losses from severe weather events in Canada are significant and rising. So if you look at the graph here, it shows the annual insured losses. Over the last decade, annual losses have averaged 1.9 billion per year. But I want to draw your attention to 2016, the year of the Fort McMurray wildfire. I think I have that right. I have my picture over me. I just want to pull your attention to this because it was the costliest disaster in Canada's history. I think the insured losses were about 3.9 billion, but the costs extended well beyond just the insured losses because there were also impacts on both social impacts. You think about the community evacuations, the impacts on mental health, the physical health impacts from the smoke. There were impacts on ecosystem services where water quality in the region decreased in many of the rivers, and the costs for water treatment rose. There were also impacts on industry, where the oil and gas sector lost a significant amount of revenue due to the closures. And it ties into the climate disclosure chapter too, because if we're seeing an increased trend in fires, longer fire seasons, increased severity, this has implications for for companies to disclose this as a material risk. It's also clear the impacts will differ between regions, subregions, sectors, and cities. There will be some positive impacts, as I mentioned. Some examples highlighted within the report are their longer growing seasons could benefit agriculture in some regions of the prairies. In some cases, tourism also benefit from longer tourist seasons. And the impacts are evident along all stages for companies of the production and supply chains. So it's actually quite broader. It's right from the exploration stage, if you think about the energy sector or the mining sector, right through to the reclamation stage. On a positive note, however, the cost and benefits chapter found that every dollar invested in adaptation generates on average $5 to $6 in benefits. And this was found by looking at 60 different examples of adaptation, including on sea level rise, lower water levels in the Great Lakes, and extreme heat. And I'm happy to say we do have Richard Boyd on the line today. He'll be able to answer more questions on that in the Q&A period. So this key finding draws directly from the international chapters. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it's imperative to look beyond our borders in order to understand the impacts of climate change for Canada. At a global level, climate stressors will interact with non-climate factors to impact things like international trade. To consider that in Canada, I think it's more than half of our GDP is derived from the import and export of goods and services. There's also implications for human migration. Think about extreme events, sea level rise, floods, droughts elsewhere, stability and conflict, and also for transboundary resources. In this case, the chapter looked at water resources as well as fisheries. So we can expect to see indirect impacts on things like the affordability of traded goods. And we've seen this in recent years where a drought in Russia caused the prices of wheat to increase around the world, including in Canada. We can also expect to see supply losses and business interruptions. Demands for international assistance will likely shift and increase. And there's also the potential for sovereignty challenges related to Arctic shipping, including the Northwest Passage, which currently is in ice-covered water, but in the future may no longer be. So it's clear that there are large gaps that remain in our preparedness for climate change. And this is most clearly demonstrated by the recent impacts of extreme weather events, such as floods and wildfires. This leads the report to conclude that there's clear evidence of an adaptation deficit in Canada. And what this means is that while there are many excellent examples of adaptation, these are highlighted throughout the report, they can be found within the case stories, they are simply not keeping pace with the increasing risks from both the current weather extremes and future climate changes. It's also clear that while nearly every economic sector in Canada is or will be impacted by climate change, there's currently no widespread evidence of corporate adaptation. And while again, there have been many excellent examples of adaptation plans and strategies and implementation at the community level, the progress overall is slow. This means that it's imperative to accelerate progress on adaptation, and this requires rapid, urgent, but deliberate plans and actions in order to ensure Canada's future economic and social well-being. So as I mentioned, there are many examples of adaptation throughout the report. You'll find this in the case stories. There's also discussion on adaptation. And from these different examples, we pulled out a number of what we call good practices to help guide successful adaptation. The first one, if you think back to the key finding number 1, is that factoring social equity into adaptation decisions reduces vulnerability and helps to ensure that the benefits of adaptation are distributed fairly. It's also clear that Indigenous knowledge is absolutely critical to understanding climate change impacts and informing adaptation planning, policies, and action. An interesting finding, too, is that disclosure of climate-related risks is emerging as a key driver of adaptation in the private sector. And this is especially important considering what was on the previous slide in terms of the fact that there's limited evidence of adaptation occurring in the private sector at the moment. It's also clear from the examples that I've talked about throughout this presentation and that are throughout the report that climate change is impacting so many aspects of our lives. It's affecting us in many different ways. And in order to address climate change effectively through adaptation, widespread collaboration is absolutely necessary. It must occur across and between sectors, levels of government, and organizations. Finally, flexible approaches such as adaptive management are increasingly being used to address climate change impacts. And flexible approaches are important because the climate is continuing to change. So now I'm going to introduce you to our website. We're incredibly excited to be able to provide all the reports online. Just looking at some of the numbers that we've had in the past, our previous reports were all published as print and PDF versions. And at that time, we could expect in the tens of thousands of downloads. After we've released, since the release of the CCCR online, the numbers are in the hundreds of thousands. So it's made a huge difference to the access to the report. And for that, we're extremely happy. Key features that you'll find on the website include embedded videos. There's many beautiful illustrative photos. All the content is shareable. Click the button. The figures are all downloadable, free to use in presentations, and some of these are interactive. It also allows us to include hyperlinks between the different sections of reports, and there is a search function where you can search the full report for specific phrases or words. On the website, you'll also find a page of frequently asked questions. There's also a newsroom where there are infographics and where these presentations will be afterwards, which again will be free for anyone to use. And we also have the case story map, which I'll talk about on the next page. Just before I click on though, I just want to point out that the chapters are still all available as accessible PDFs on both the NRCan website and at changingclimate.ca. So this was a project that we worked on or co-led with Environment and Climate Change Canada. So it's a map of adaptation actions. It's also found at changingclimate.ca/case studies. And what it does is provide an interactive, searchable map of examples of adaptation in practice. And these are from a range of sources. So all case stories from the national assessment process will be housed here, but there are also many, many others which Environment and Climate Change Canada has compiled. So it's an excellent resource for decision makers and adaptation practitioners. I encourage you to visit that chapter. So in conclusion, the report really demonstrates that climate change is affecting so many aspects of our lives, nearly all sectors of our economy, our communities, our environment. Increased actions on adaptation are urgently needed, as adaptation is critical to reducing the risks, the negative impacts on Canadians. So just before I pass it over to Eva for the panel discussion with the lead authors, I just want to remind you that the other 5 regional chapters will be coming out over the fall and winter. The health assessment will be coming out in the fall, and then the Indigenous Resilience Report will be out in spring 2022. So with that, I'm going to say thank you to everyone for your attention, and I'm going to pass it over to someone I've had the pleasure of working with over the past 3 or 4 years, Eva Jackson, the Managing Director from ICLEI Canada, who will lead the panel discussion. Thanks, Eva.
Thank you, Fiona. This is a really exciting day for those of us who have been involved with the assessment process for some time now. And I'm delighted to get to moderate this Q&A. So thanks, Fiona, for the opportunity. As Fiona said, my name is Eva Jackson, and I'm Managing Director with ICLEI Canada. I'd like to gratefully acknowledge that the land I live and work on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It is now known as Toronto and continues to be home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. With that, I'll take the opportunity to introduce a number of the authors that we have joining us for the panel discussion, and that will give you all a chance to get your questions ready as you see these people who have been involved in this material and are excited to hand it over to you. So on the line for today for Cities and Towns chapter, we've got Craig Brown with Vancouver Coastal Health, Sophie Guibault with the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. For rural and remote communities, Ashley Consolo with Memorial University, along with Kelly Vauden and Camille Huet-Delaire, also with Memorial University. Underwater Resources, Haley Carlson with the Global Institute for Water Security, University of Saskatchewan, and her colleague Al Pietranero with the Global Institute for Water Security. Ecosystem Services, Michelle Molnar with the David Suzuki Foundation. Costs and Benefits of Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation, Richard Boyd with All One Sky Foundation, and Anil Markandia with the Basque Center for Climate Change. Sector Impacts and Adaptation, Catherine Lafleur with Natural Resources Canada. Climate Disclosure, Litigation and Finance, Paul Kovacs with the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. And finally, International Dimensions, Jimena Ezeguirre with ESSA, and Robert McLemon with Wilfrid Laurier University. So we've got a lot of people, and what I'll do now is I will ask that whoever's sharing the screen, stop sharing the screen so we can have a nice view and a conversation across the group. I'll have my screen ready to go here. And I think we'll start with the first question that we have. I'd like to put this one to Craig and Haley, if I might. And the impacts of climate change on infrastructure seem very severe. What are some examples of how we can adapt? And Craig, perhaps I'll start with you and then hand it over to Haley.
Absolutely. Thank you, Eva. And thanks everybody for being here. Very excited on behalf of all the authors. We're thrilled to be sharing this finally with the world. Yeah, I think for infrastructure and adaptation in Canada's cities and towns, it's important to remember that roughly 2/3 of Canada's public infrastructure is owned and maintained by municipal governments. So this is buildings, roads, bridges, water and wastewater systems, etc. We've seen how kind of sensitive and exposed this infrastructure can be during extreme weather events. If you remember 2013 rainfall flooding in Toronto, the flooding in southern Alberta in 2013 as well, the Fort McMurray wildfire. These events and so many others obviously create impacts for infrastructure in cities and towns. And as Fiona mentioned earlier, much of this is infrastructure is very old and in need of replacement. The common figure is about 1/3 of the infrastructure in cities and towns is in need of retrofit or replacement. This is obviously very costly. Many cities kind of couldn't do this work even if they raised taxes significantly. And so luckily, there's some resources being made available by multiple levels of government, Infrastructure Canada, Federation of Canadian Municipalities, provincial, regional initiatives that really help municipal governments, lead on responding to some of these challenges. And some examples include Delta and Surrey and Semiahmoo First Nation out here in British Columbia received $76 million from the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund. And that went towards funding a coastal adaptation strategy that's going to protect over 125,000 residents as the ocean levels continue to rise out here. It's going to use a combination of traditional infrastructure approaches, dikes, etc., but also including nature-based solutions like floodable parks as well. And so an example of this commitment to adaptation out here. Another way that cities and towns are adapting is through incorporating the future climate into how they manage their infrastructure assets. So this practice called asset management, which those of you on the line from cities and towns should be familiar with. It's a systematic way of making decisions about how to upgrade your infrastructure. In many communities, Selkirk, Manitoba, and Courtenay, BC, and others have incorporated future climate considerations into that process. An example comes from Fredericton, New Brunswick, who had flooding in 2018 and 2019, as well as many other years. And for nearly 20 years has been trying to anticipate what is the future climate going to look like when they're deciding how big of a culvert to install, or when they were developing their active transportation network, they knew that it needed to come online to keep the city functional when the main roads were flooded. And so that's just another example of adaptation that you'll find in the Cities and Towns chapter. And I think I'll leave it there now and turn it back over to Eva.
Thanks, Craig. Wonderful to hear that so much is happening in cities and towns. I wonder, Haley, if just a few words from the water resources perspective on what can be done to adapt infrastructure.
Sure, thanks. As our chapter makes clear, water resources are one of the main, or water-related impacts of climate change are one of the main hazards to Canadian infrastructure. And in the chapter, we emphasize good information and data provision and good infrastructure design. So one of the approaches around good infrastructure design includes the application of the Public Infrastructure Engineering Vulnerability Committee Protocol, which is a 5-step procedure to systematically assess the engineering vulnerability and risk from current and future climate impacts. And this has been applied in dozens of local water future climate impact studies across Canada, including the city of Calgary and the city of Nelson. And in general, best practices for resilient water infrastructure design and operation include things like having good maintenance and management, building redundancies into water systems. So things like building multiple intake points or delivery mechanisms. For new infrastructure, of course, considering climate change impacts during the project design phase, and ensuring any infrastructure-related codes or standards or related instruments reflect reliable and up-to-date, as best as possible, information of climate and how that might change into the future. Our chapter also discusses nature-based approaches, which essentially uses the natural resources like soils or plants or wetlands to reduce or mitigate the impact of climate change or natural hazards. And it's a useful approach because it can be implemented to complement existing built infrastructure, and it also tends to be a bit more flexible and offer co-benefits. So this approach is being applied more widely across Canada, and a few case studies that we do discuss in the chapter include Gibson's BC, the Toronto Green Roof Program, and Pelly's Lake, which is a restored wetland in Manitoba as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Haley. Michelle, I wonder if you could help expand a little bit on natural infrastructure and how that fits into a conversation around adapting infrastructure.
Sure, I'd be happy to, Eva. So it's increasingly apparent that working with nature and protecting and managing it so that it may in turn protect us is part of the solution. And to that end, we see a growing number of Canadian governments, primarily local governments, are recognizing natural areas and systems as natural infrastructure. They're recognizing that it is as important to understand, measure, manage, and account for their natural infrastructure as it is for their hard or engineered infrastructure. And that's because doing so allows them to manage risk by better understanding how those services may be affected under conditions of climate change, what types of risks they're facing. And many are also finding, as Haley mentioned, that they can often provide these services at lower cost with additional benefits, and that the quality of services provided can meet or exceed those of engineered infrastructure. So just a few examples. Craig and Haley have mentioned a few, so thank you very much. But in Truro, Nova Scotia, they found that storm surges and flooding was breaching dikes, which were protecting their communities, their infrastructure. They've started undergoing tidal wetland restoration, and are anticipating that the North Oslo tidal wetlands will be operating as a near optimum salt marsh habitat while acting as a storm buffer to local communities, providing wildlife habitat, as well as a range of recreational, health, and other benefits. We also see this happening on a broader scale across Canada with the development of green belts. Very connected systems to manage the infrastructure that local governments are primarily mandated to manage. So maybe I'll leave it at that, Eva, and turn it back to you. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's interesting you mentioned this idea of co-benefits, as our next question really touches on that idea of benefits. And the report outlines or says that climate change will present some benefits for Canada, but future economic impacts will overwhelmingly be negative and high. I wonder, Richard, if you could elaborate on this from your perspective as the author of the Cost and Benefits chapter.
Hi, Eva. Yeah, certainly. I think as a starting point, it's important to understand that all economies like Canada's have foundational building blocks: labor, manufactured capital like buildings, infrastructure, and natural capital, land, and primarily raw materials. And climate-related hazards can adversely impact all three of these building blocks, and in turn have an adverse impact upon the economy and economic growth. Buildings and infrastructure, for example, can be directly damaged by extreme events, necessitating the diversion of resources from other productive uses within the economy to pay for repairs. And at the same time, production and service provision can be disrupted, And this can have indirect impacts up and down the value chain, which can have cascading knock-on effects throughout the economy, multiplying the significance of the direct effects. And just also like thinking about labor, there's plenty of evidence out there that our willingness to work and also our productivity at work declines in hotter weather. And this suggests that the economic output in Canada will decline as it warms moving into the future, particularly in high-risk sectors with largely outdoor workforces. And if you just think about like taking labor for an example, there's studies that show that the impact of a persistent warming on productivity and economic growth in Canada will reduce gross domestic product per capita in 2100 by about 13%. And that taking that today, that would be equivalent to a loss of around $170 billion. And that's just a loss from one potential economic consequence via one impact channel. That's not looking at the full spectrum of potential impact. But it's also important to consider that these impacts, which are captured in provincial and national economic accounts, only paint a partial picture of the true costs of climate change for Canada. As Fiona alluded to in the introduction presentation, what we really are interested in is the aggregate overall welfare impacts that is attributable to climate change. And this includes impacts on things that we value as Canadians, but that do not necessarily have a market price, this sort of so-called intangibles. And this includes things like loss of habitat or species, premature death, pain and suffering and distress from illness and injury, mental health disorders, etc. And importantly, as the chapter shows, there's evidence that these intangibles can be significant in magnitude and potentially larger than some of the conventional market-based costs of climate change. And just as another example, the welfare costs attributable to climate change induced health effects from exposures to ground level ozone and to heat stress have been put at around $255 billion by the end of the century. And so I think when you put all of the evidence together that's summarized within the chapter, accepting that there's still many gaps in that evidence base, it's not a stretch to conclude that the future costs of climate change for Canada will be significant, high, and negative. Regarding sectors that benefit, there are studies showing that like the two most prominent sectors are tourism, where you're going to potentially see an increased international visitation inflow to Canada and more sort of staycations as Canadians opt to stay at home. And then also agriculture, and particularly with respect to increased crop production. Those are the primary sectors where benefits have been quantified in monetary terms. But I just want to caveat the findings of those studies by saying that they don't really capture all of the potential impacts and consequences of climate change. And these sort of gaps in the studies and their sort of narrower scope does suggest that the overall net impact might actually be unclear and potentially negative. For example, like looking at agriculture, it doesn't really look at, the studies don't consider impacts from heat stress on livestock. They don't look at extreme weather events like drought or wildfires, for example. But I mean, overall, the picture is definitely one of rising and potentially high negative costs.
Thanks so much, Richard. Catherine, I wonder whether you could offer some commentary on whether some sectors are going to be harder hit financially than others.
Thanks, Eva. So just to clarify, the chapter doesn't go into strict economic analysis within a sector or across sectors, but it did highlight a number of sectors, 7 of the sectors that are sort of considered the key economic sectors within Canada. And so it is looking at impacts within those economic sectors. So some of them are hit harder than others in some cases, in that they're hit on the primary production side. So things like forestry, fisheries, agriculture, and hydroelectric generation. So they're having some primary production impacts, but all of the sectors will face both kind of direct and indirect impacts. A lot of indirect impacts in terms of infrastructure degradation and impacts that have been mentioned, as well as supply chain issues, getting both workers and supplies to and from your workplaces. And so, the COVID pandemic that we're still living through has really put an emphasis on the importance of supply chains. I think that's become a common everyday term now. And climate change is definitely something that's going to impact and affect those supply chains. So within the chapter, there is a case study on the Fort McMurray wildfire that Fiona talked about in the introduction. And there's also a table that shows sort of some direct and indirect costs that come out of things like the Fort McMurray wildfire. So it's like fire suppression and evacuation costs and the loss of timber, but also those indirect costs like business shutdowns and unemployment and the health costs. So you have to look at a more fulsome and holistic picture. These impacts don't just impact one sector in isolation. Things like agriculture, it depends heavily on freight transportation to get goods to market and get supplies to the farms. As well as energy demand, that has cascading impacts throughout. Right now, there's a heat wave out in Western Canada. Demand for energy and air conditioning is going up. For hydroelectric, you need to make sure you have the water available to sustain that demand. So I guess the important point here is some of the sectors will be hit harder than others, but you need to look at a more holistic picture because there's cascading impacts from one sector to another.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Ashley, a question for you about the rural and remote communities chapter. Social equity is mentioned a lot with respect to adaptation. How are communities taking this into account in their planning from within your chapter?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. I think it really builds off the conversations that we've already been having. I mean, rural and remote regions, as well as Indigenous communities within these rural and remote areas of Canada, are often experiencing, some of the hardest hitting impacts of a changing climate, are often on the front lines, but are the places that sometimes have the least amount of resources available, are farthest from decision-making centers of power, and yet also provide the country with, food, water, energy, and resources. So we have this really unequal balance where a lot of the communities who are experiencing some of the hardest impacts of climate change right now are also the communities that the rest of Canada relies on tremendously to supply all of these resources. So when you're talking about climate change in rural and remote areas, it really is a justice and equity discussion as well. Who has the resources to adapt and what are communities doing, and then who has responsibilities to support communities within this. But when you look at also the strengths of rural and remote communities, the place-based knowledge systems, the Indigenous knowledge systems, the deep connections to land, to livelihoods, the ways in which the ecosystem supports are there for people, and the often long-standing knowledge that people hold, there's tremendous adaptive capacity there as well. But these discussions have to go hand in hand with what sectors of this country do we often forget about, and whose voices are we not hearing, and where, so much of what we hear about climate change is coming out of a lot of the urban and populated areas. For example, I live in Labrador on the homelands of the Innu and Inuit, and Labrador is one of the fastest warming places in Canada and has been at the front lines of climate change for decades. And yet discussions on climate change sort of in Atlantic Canada often forget Labrador and the knowledge that's here, but also the tremendous need for adaptive resources and supports. So it really does become an equity and social justice issue, as well as an infrastructure, economic, health, it all has to tie in hand.
Thank you for giving us that perspective. You mentioned economic, and our next question is in that space. Paul, I wonder if you could comment on how disclosure is a driver of adaptation.
Eva, thank you for the opportunity. The writing team was really excited to put together this chapter looking at disclosure, finance, and liability. There has been a remarkable increase in literature and written material on these topics. This is a new area for the assessment process to write about this literature, and it was a real thrill to have the team working together to share this information. Our key finding was that climate change is increasing an issue for the business community. The business community are trying to figure out how to transition to a low carbon economy. and how to adapt to the physical damage risks that are coming from storms and other extreme events. And as the business community are learning their way here, this is a public policy issue. So it was great to have this opportunity to put together this material. Your specific question, Eva, was related to disclosure. If a company is a publicly traded company, they're required to disclose material risks. If there's something material to the company, they must explain what they are doing in terms of policy and strategy about that risk to shareholders and others. Across this country, we've had a number of crown corporations, municipal governments that are also choosing to disclose more about climate change and what it means for them. What it means in terms of, again, transition and physical damage risk, even liability risk where it's important. As that disclosure is coming, this is creating the foundation for shareholders to judge the company, for the companies to choose what actions they're doing, for customers, for other parties to better measure and articulate the specific risks. The foundation for action on adaptation is just far stronger where disclosure is growing. And this is going to be increasingly an incredibly important space over time as individual entities are carefully looking at what's happening to their organization and disclosing what climate change means for them. This will be a really powerful driver for adaptation in our view going forward. This is what the literature is saying. This is an emerging area. And in particular, one of the spaces we're waiting on is that there are several different guidance approaches to how you disclose, what approach we use. And in particular, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. This is a voluntary industry-led effort. There's a number of Canadian companies that are part of this global effort to figure out how to properly disclose transition risk, fiscal damage risk, liability risk if appropriate, so that it is informing shareholders, but informing others about what's happening. The task force leadership on this file is creating what is probably emerging as the new standard that is being picked up in the private sector, but also by government entities to properly disclose. We think that across disclosure, finance, and liability, these are all really important issues, and I hope people will have time to read the whole chapter, but disclosure will be a really important driver going forward. Thanks, Eva.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Diane, I see that your video's on. I wonder if I could trouble you. Il y a une question en français.
Oui, pas de problème, Eva. Donc, cette question se dirige vers le chapitre des dimensions internationales. Donc, Robert, si vous pouvez répondre. Comment le changement climatique affecte-t-il les migrations humaines? Le Canada devrait-il s'y préparer?
D'accord, bonjour tout le monde. Donc, dans notre chapitre, nous avons considéré, par exemple, que les pays qui sont les plus grandes sources de migration au Canada, par exemple l'Inde, la Chine, les Philippines, le Pakistan, la Syrie, etc., sont aussi tellement vulnérables et exposés au changement des impacts des événements climatiques extrêmes, par exemple les inondations, la sécheresse, les tempêtes, etc. Et donc, quand il y a un événement comme ça outre-mer, il y a des familles, des communautés ici au Canada qui expériencent des impacts émotionnels, financiers, etc. Et donc, ce que nous allons voir à l'avenir, c'est que quand ces événements deviennent de plus en plus fréquents, il y aura de plus en plus pression sur le gouvernement du Canada pour réagir à ces risques avec l'adaptation, le développement, mais aussi des accommodations dans les politiques de migration, les programmes de migration. Donc, je pense que ça va devenir de plus en plus fréquent à l'avenir. Il y a aussi un autre exemplaire dans notre chapitre avec le cas de Mali, un pays dans l'ouest de l'Afrique. Il y a 2 ans, les forces canadiennes étaient là pour maintenir la paix là à cause de conflits qui ont des liens avec la sécheresse et les changements climatiques et le mouvement des personnes autour des frontières dans l'ouest d'Afrique. Donc, voici 2 exemplaires des risques pour le Canada à l'avenir. Merci.
Merci, thank you, Robert. Fiona, a question has come in through a Q&A box. we'd like to direct to you that there's a lot of mention around adaptation within the report. Is mitigation addressed in any capacity, or has it, or will it be addressed in another report?
Thanks for the question. So the report really does focus on impacts and adaptation. Though in the introduction chapter, we do talk about the linkages between the two, because it's very clear that we need both. Both are extremely important. We need to mitigate in order to adapt. We need to adapt, and regardless of, we need to adapt now, we need to adapt in the future. So in terms of the linkages to mitigation, the greater the climate changes, the more difficult adaptation will be, the less options there are for adaptation, and the more likely the chances are of crossing the tipping points. So we don't go into detail on mitigation. There are many other publications available on that. It's not part of our current assessment process, but we do recognize the linkages between the two. And in some of the chapters, I believe we do talk about some of the co-benefits too. So within the cities and towns chapter, I would think we talk about some of the co-benefits in terms of air quality and actions, as well as the ecosystem services chapter. But the focus really is on adaptation within our process itself.
Thanks, Fiona. Robert, a question for you. The report highlights the need to accelerate adaptation action in Canada. What can you say about the progress that has been made on adaptation in Canada compared to the efforts of other countries?
Well, I will speak on behalf not of the Government of Canada, but on my own experience working on other international organizations and so on. And we are very slow compared to certain countries, particularly in Western Europe, where there have already been significant investments made in looking at the different sectors of the economy, looking at urban infrastructure, and many of the things we talk about in this report. If you think about Germany and France and the UK, they're already quite far ahead and advanced in these areas. And also in the area where I work, which is the international dimensions, there's a lot of outreach being taken by European governments to work with countries in Africa, in South Asia, and others, countries that are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So Canada's been a bit slow on this initiative. I think part of it's because we often react to politics, climate politics in the United States, which have been quite tumultuous over the last few years. I think this report showcases the need for Canadians to start to seriously think about not just the mitigation of greenhouse gases, which has been an important government priority in recent years, but now the fact that we are going to have to adapt to a changing climate, even as we try to mitigate our greenhouse gases. So this is I would encourage viewers to think of this report as a springboard or a call to action on behalf of Canadians.
Thanks, Robert. Fiona, back to you with a question from the Q&A. Does the report distinguish between inherent and residual risks? Has the ability of risk control measures used today been considered to manage incremental climate-driven risks? This consideration would enable to assess residual risks that need to be treated depending on risk tolerance.
Thank you for that question. I would say yes and no. I mean, it doesn't explicitly look at the difference between the different types of risks, but we do really consider examples of actions that have been taken that increase resilience, whether or not they were designed specifically to address climate change adaptation. I might be tempted to throw that question over to Richard, actually, who talks a lot in this chapter about the relative costs of impacts and adaptation, because I think that ties in nicely here. Richard?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm going to add much to what Fiona said. Typically, within the economic studies that are reviewed and reported within the chapter, there is a creation of a business as usual baseline, which would include the existing risk mitigation measures. And this, like the best practice studies, will try to quantify the sort of residual risk that's attributable solely to climate change, and that also includes removing the contribution that socioeconomic development is also making. So the studies tend to try and focus on quantifying risk attributable solely to climate change over and above the risks associated with socioeconomic development, which would also include inbuilt risk mitigation measures as a sort of business as usual scenario. I'm not sure if that helps.
Thanks, Richard. I think it offers a robust answer for where we're at now. The Q&A box is alive and well, so I'm just going to continue. Paul, the next question is directed towards you. There's a lot of new research coming on stream about the subject of climate tipping points. To what extent is the adaptation framework attempting to take account of potential tipping points that could easily turn our adaptation plans into disaster management plans?
Thank you, Eva. Thank you for the question. We did not explicitly address tipping points in our chapter. We were emphasizing the exciting developments that are happening with respect to disclosure, the opportunities for finance, where there are now many, many different sources coming forward with finance. For those who have adaptation ideas, finding funds has always been an issue, and we're identifying more. And liability has shown up as part of the conversation in a number of specific circumstances, and the liability story is a complicated one, so we wanted to go through in depth. And so that didn't leave us a lot of room to also get into the area of tipping points, which is important literature, but it's not addressed in much depth at this time in our particular report.
Thank you, Paul. The next question is for Craig and the Cities and Towns chapter. And other authors, if you'd like to contribute to this, I'll just ask you to raise your hand, and we'll take one or two kind of follow-ups if there is another author that'd like to tackle this. One of the biggest barriers to climate change is inaction or denial. How do you suggest one, I'm going to paraphrase, tackles this issue to increase adaptation or action towards climate change? One being an organization, perhaps, and not an individual.
Thanks for that question. I think probably speak for many of the folks on the line that once you get into working on climate adaptation and you're working with decision makers, policymakers, I think that this barrier becomes a little less significant at that level. I think, sure, culturally, we're still experiencing some of this. Our chapter really didn't dive into the literature on, on behavior change or on this dimension of climate denial or skepticism or anything like that. I think that for many, and I'm sure this is common across the chapters, that the risks are crystal clear now and becoming, as Richard's chapter shows, as Paul's chapter shows, as is shown elsewhere. I mean, the case for adaptation is stronger and stronger by the day. So I think that barrier, to the extent that it exists, is decreasing. I think that our chapter identified a number of other barriers, as Paul just mentioned, access to financing, data and tools, et cetera. And many of these are, as I kind of mentioned in my first response, being addressed as well, and rather, in an encouraging manner. Yes, there's still obviously an adaptation deficit, but progress is being made for sure. And in terms of how to overcome this, how to encourage action, I think there's a number of ways. I mean, adaptation can be quite a doomy and gloomy topic, but I think ultimately we're talking about quality of life and about envisioning a future that we all want to work towards. And so I found in my own work, and I think the chapter reflects this to a certain extent as well in the case stories and elsewhere, that adaptation gives us an opportunity to redesign our social systems, to redesign our built environment, and to really start to take steps towards that future we want. And an example of that too is this inclusion now, or emphasis on low carbon resilience, where we're trying to account for, or trying to make sure that we adapt in a way that also does what it can to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so I think that's an inspiring vision that brings together a lot of the folks who've been working in this space as well. So I think that gives you my sense of the answer, and I'm happy for Eva to pass it off to other authors as well to chime in.
Yeah, we have time for follow-ups from Fiona, Paul, and Catherine, I think. So just a minute or two each, please.
Yeah, thanks. I'll go fast. I just wanted to point out that we did a survey a few years ago of Canadians, and we asked them, do you feel you're seeing the impacts of climate change in your community? And the response rate we actually had, I think it was 89% said yes. So within Canada, I'm not sure if the top issue is really denial of climate change. Canadians are seeing the impacts. They're seeing how it's impacting their lives. I think it's really more a question of really doing a better job of conveying the risks, helping people to prioritize action. So, I mean, that's why we do these reports, really. And reports are a great resource for people, but there's many other resources out there too. I'm thinking of the reports of the Canadian Institute for Climate.
Choices.
Canadian Institute for Climate.
Choices.
That's it. Perfect. And then the CCCS, the Canada Centre for Climate Services, those are the two I was mixing up. They have excellent resources. So there is a lot of information out there. So I really encourage people to visit the website, visit the map, see examples of adaptation in action. Because that's another thing we've heard, that people really want to learn from what others are doing. So I encourage you to visit that. And with that, I'll wrap up because I don't want to take the time away from the other people who are waiting.
Yep. Paul and Catherine, I'll ask you to keep your comments to a minute because we've got a slew of questions to get through.
Eva, thank you for the opportunity. Gordon McBain is on the call here. Gordon and I were part of the IPCC special report on extremes a few years ago. One of the pieces that I just share with everybody, there's an overlap between climate change and disaster management. In the disaster management community, people have been responding to disasters for a long period of time, and there's a big policy space there. It's not necessarily called adaptation, but there is a community in Canada and elsewhere around the world that are responding to disasters and what we would call adaptation in that response process. And finally, I would share that Fiona mentioned at the beginning a new resource where we're looking at case studies across Canada that are easily identifiable. Our institute's published 80 of them, looking what we call Cities Adapt, celebrating local leadership. And in all cases, these were reactive adaptation communities that experienced a bad event, and they did some really good adaptation in response. We think there's scope for transformative improvement and adaptation when you respond to an event.
Thanks, Paul. Catherine?
Right, just building on some of the previous points, like Fiona said, it may not be the knowledge and the denial, but maybe more competing priorities. So oftentimes when I talk to people about, what keeps them up at night, climate change doesn't make the top of the list, but they do list other things like market value for their product, business continuity, service delivery, customer acceptance from both, the customers and your, the environmental reputation for your customers and your investors. And so these things are all actually linked to climate change impacts. So find out what people value and show them how that links to climate change. Because not everybody, people in the panel today, this is our bread and butter and we talk about climate change adaptation all the time, but put it into terms that are important to other people and help them make the connection between what they value and how climate is going to impact that.
Great, thanks, Catherine. Next question, we'll start with Fiona, and I think Ashley will go over to you. The audience is interested to hear examples from panelists on how Indigenous knowledge has been applied to better understand climate change and to drive adaptation in practice.
Sure, yeah, so within this whole process, we've made much greater efforts to incorporate Indigenous knowledge and perspectives. So that's not just in the Indigenous Resilience Report, but it's throughout the different chapters as well. In the case of the National Issues Report, there are several case stories that were authored by Indigenous people in their own words. And maybe I could maybe pass it over to Ashley to talk about them. And I think also Craig, there's excellent examples there that will really provide more depth on that than I can provide at a high level. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Fiona. This is a hugely important area of discussion for Canada, considering the large number of Indigenous peoples, whether it's First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and the ways in which climate change is affecting them and their knowledge systems, their lands, all the political systems, the governance systems, and the knowledge sharing. So in our chapter in the rural and remote areas, we had a number of different case studies looking at Indigenous adaptation and Indigenous knowledges and sciences. Particularly around work that communities are doing across the country on monitoring and creating their own monitoring systems so that they can track change over time, but also do so in a really active way. So, there's an app being developed in Labrador where people can go out on the land and track real-time environmental conditions, whether it's changing ice or increasing storms or shifts in wildlife. And then that information is shared with the communities and with the regions. So it supports land safety travel, but it's also a long-term repository of scientific information about how things are changing. And then communities can use that in this kind of near real-time decision-making to support community health and safety. There's also some great work. A number of regions are experiencing either erosion or destruction of intangible cultural heritage and archaeological sites. So communities are mobilizing to do, digital preservation and 3D imaging so that that information can be kept even if the site itself erodes or is damaged, and that information can be shared. A lot of focus on linking youth with adults and elders so that even though some of the climatic conditions have shifted, that knowledge can continue on. So that intergenerational sharing of how, how do you travel safely? How do you hunt? How do you harvest? Where do you go? And then just the important sort of underlying science of how you have that connection to land. A really great work around coastal restoration, communities revitalizing natural areas and kind of reclaiming spaces in ecosystems. And a lot of work around keystone species, so fisheries, caribou work. So there's a whole variety of stories and adaptation pieces and wisdom that's going to come out in the Indigenous Resilience Report, also the Northern chapter. And there's great examples throughout the whole thing. So this is something I'm really excited to see so prominent in this report.
Thanks, Ashley. I'm going to move on to the next question, which is for Paul. Given the far-reaching and interconnected nature of impacts, we know that organizations face significant risks beyond those to infrastructure under their control, for example, due to supply chain disruptions. You mentioned the importance of disclosing risks related to climate. Can you speak to investigation and mitigation of risks from these knock-on effects?
Thank you, Eva. The report, as Fiona touched on, the objective of our report was to focus on climate risks. So that's what is predominantly in the chapter and in the report. We did try to acknowledge that there is a broad range of broader risks. This is certainly part of what Richard touched on in the economic factor as well. There is physical damage risk, but this extends much beyond just the physical damage to infrastructure and buildings. There are emotional, health, very, very broad range of issues that are in this report, and we will see more of in the reports that follow. On the specific part that we were asked to write about, on the disclosure side, the objective of the companies and the municipalities and the public sector organizations that are disclosing is to disclose anything material. If this is a meaningful impact on society, on the organization, they are to be more open and disclose more of what that risk is and what they're doing about it. This is a growing expectation that will build over time in the disclosure part of what we wrote about. In the liability part of what we wrote about, there are really important elements of liability that are, for me, quite nuanced and specific. But broadly, a sense, if you are taking, if you are responsible for actions that have an impact on others, it can be a physical impact, but it can be in many, many other ways. You may be found liable in the courts for that. And there is a very careful review of the literature about where liability is and is not being found in the courts that we lay out in detail, which goes much beyond just the physical side. And certainly we write about finance. If you're going to take action, finding the money is really important, and being creative and putting the resources up to do the right thing. There's a fairly clear articulation. So certainly the intent in our part of the report, and in my understanding across the full report, was to look beyond just the physical impacts, look at the physical, but more, and the broader impacts on society the best we could. But some of those are hard to quantify and measure, but the intent certainly is to look beyond just the physical.
Thanks, Paul. I think that echoes Rory's introductory comments about taking a systems approach to the assessment and looking at those issues. Michelle, I apologize, I missed a question for you, so I'm going to jump back into our list of questions. And an attendee has a question mentioning that you had spoken about the importance of nature-based solutions. Is there a plan to protect the Hudson Bay lowlands and other large wetland areas?
That's a good question. I'm not aware of any existing plans right now to address the Hudson Bay lowlands. That said, nature-based solutions is really a broad umbrella term for a range of approaches that look at working with nature. So absolutely, there could be various approaches looking at ecosystem-based management, protected areas, restoration, natural asset management. But at this time, we didn't come across any specific plans related to that specific location.
Great, thank you, Michelle. I'm going to jump up into my question list. One thing I would like to mention that for questions that aren't answered, the Secretariat will take these questions and circulate the answers to all attendees. So if your question is not addressed directly, please just await that by email. We only have so much time today. A question for Richard, and with that to my panelists, if you could keep your responses as tight as possible, we'll get through as much as we can. The cost of implementing adaptation measures to manage climate-driven risks can be prohibitive. Have risks or adaptation measures been compared and prioritized? Against which criteria would this wide array of risks be compared? Economic, health, environment. So Richard, I'll ask you to answer that question.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that's the sort of goal of the economic appraisal of adaptation options, is to contrast the costs of the adaptations themselves with a range of the benefits that are generated, and then also factoring in the opportunity cost of using those resources for adaptation versus using them for alternative uses. In terms of like different criteria, there's a range of criteria that we identified within the chapter, both on the sort of cost side and also on the benefit side. And so you're on the cost side, you're kind of trading off looking at also the feasibility of having the adaptation action adopted, both from a technical perspective and then also the availability of resources and the affordability, for example, within a municipal budget. Then also things like the acceptability in terms of like getting political buy-in and buy-in from the citizens as well. And then a key factor on the benefit side is regards to uncertainty. So it's not just about monetizing damages avoided, but it's also about taking into account uncertainty in both the climate moving forward and then also taking into account uncertainty in the performance of the adaptation measures. And there's a range of different decision support tools that are discussed within the chapter that move beyond traditional cost-benefit analysis and work at trying to integrate uncertainty into the analysis, and also social equity. Again, that's something else that's discussed within the chapter in terms of how can you integrate social equity within the overall sort of decision calculus.
Well, I have you, Richard. I'll ask you to keep your video on. Another question for you. It would be important to address in future reports the economical impact evaluation in non-economic tangible assets. For example, ecosystem services, cultural heritage, society impact, relationships, etc. Does the analytical framework for this analysis exist?
Yes, and actually, a few of the studies that are in there at the moment will already do that. They monetize the impacts upon select ecosystem services. Like when I talked earlier, I mentioned that there are studies looking at the welfare losses associated with the impacts on public health, and like with heat and ozone and Lyme disease, etc. And then I'm not aware of studies that we found within Canada that look at impacts upon spiritual and sites of cultural heritage, but I am aware of such work in Europe. So I think that the frameworks and methods exist. It's just a case of getting their applications within Canada built out a little more.
Wonderful, thank you for that. Haley, a question for you in the Water Resources chapter. Many places in Canada are dealing with flooding in one year and then drought the next year. How do you plan for that?
Thanks. Yeah, this is a reality for me. I'm speaking from Treaty 6 territory in Western Canada, so we already deal with those conditions. And this question to me speaks a lot about uncertainty. So the fact that we don't always know what we're going to be getting in the future, and we may well have more extreme wet and dry cycles. So in the chapter, we have a section talking about how organizations are starting to plan and operate in new ways to account for this future uncertainty. One of the strategies they're engaging in involves using future scenarios to engage stakeholders to develop adaptive strategies that work well no matter what kind of future we're going to be receiving. And so this can involve the development of what is called low regret or robust solutions, things like water conservation and upgrading monitoring networks that will serve us well regardless of whether we have floods or droughts in the future. And another strategy that we talk about in the chapter is adaptive management, which is essentially a structured or systematic approach to continuous monitoring and updating plans as new information becomes available. And this has been implemented in places such as Lake Superior and Lake Ontario by the International Joint Commission as a way to adapt to those conditions that may change very rapidly, from very wet couple of years to very dry couple of years.
Great, thank you. Robert, a question for you. In terms of migration, to what extent has the impact of climate refugees from the US been considered?
Yes, well, we flagged that in our chapter, the International Dimensions one, as a topic that will need to be monitored in the future. There's not a lot of data in terms of how climate events in the US affect cross-border migration to Canada, or indeed the return migration of Canadians from the US to Canada. Just in my own personal experience, I know that the cities of Seattle and Portland, for example, are already making preparations to receive influxes of migrants from the southwestern United States because of extreme heat and water shortages and wildfires and so on. And that reflects a reality that most climate-related migration takes place within country. So most Americans who move for climate-related reasons will probably stay in the United States. But at the same time, there could be an observable increase in the number of Americans wanting to move to Canada. And indeed, we've seen it from other countries as well. We see certain parts of the world where there's severe environmental degradation happening right now. We see a small percentage increase of people migrating from those countries to Canada under our usual immigration programs for skilled workers and family reunification and so on. So all that to say, it's something worth monitoring in the future, because the Americans are going to face some very, very serious challenges in coming decades as a result of climate change.
Thank you, Robert. Catherine, a question for you has come in the Q&A. In Canada, which sectors are leaders in adaptation, and which sectors really need to get started on their adaptation work?
Challenging question. We didn't do a big compare and contrast, but I guess the ones that would be considered more leaders are those ones that have the more direct impacts, like forestry, fisheries, agriculture, because it's real, it's for them now, whereas some of the other sectors see this as a distant threat. So, you know, the sooner, and I guess as well, some of the industries that have the longer time horizons, like mining and reclamation, forestry in terms of, you know, the time required to grow trees and whatnot. So you really need to take action earlier and make sure, you know, your planning and design is working for, you know, future, like in terms of mining and reclamation. Make sure you take action now. It may not, you know, have impacts until 20 years from now, but still you need to start early. So I guess it's the ones that are that shorter time horizon are kind of considered the leaders in the field. But really, I think like Fiona mentioned, you should get started as soon as you can and do that risk assessment and risk and opportunity assessment, really, because the more options are available to you now. You know, as time goes on, there will be fewer of those low-hanging fruit or easy options or things that you can implement over time as you go. So it's really imperative to start your planning and be really decisive about that now, because you'll have more options and it'll be more financially feasible the earlier you start.
Yeah, it echoes some of Paul's comments around preparatory or reactive. The sooner you start, the more preparatory it can be. A question for Ashley and Craig, and I'll ask you, Ashley, you go first, and each keep your answers short, but an attendee would like to know that given municipalities are at the front lines responding to impacts, are there governance models elsewhere that can serve as best practices for getting appropriate investments to make adaptation happen on the ground faster?
That's a great question. We didn't see too much of that in the literature that we pulled in our chapters, but we are seeing it within Indigenous communities in particular, where communities are realizing not only at the front lines, but they need to take sort of this governance into their own hands and start to make decisions with or without support from provincial or federal or territorial level governments. So we're seeing shifts in that where people are starting to make their own changes, you know, within their own communities. And the governance models are often very collaborative and working with multiple generations to bring in, you know, youth, that sort of middle age and elders all together for decision making, and then also relying on the best available research and working with other key partners and stakeholders to kind of come together to make collective place-based decisions.
And Craig, from the perspective of larger towns and cities?
I think from my chapter's perspective, we didn't necessarily assess like international literature or examples from elsewhere, but I know that in the flood risk management space, for example, there's plenty of great examples where you've got the private sector and the insurance sector working with government, relying on, you know, protective behaviors adopted by citizens. And so we reflected that to a certain extent. You know, there's a section in the chapter that presents a literature on the role of citizens, the role of non-governmental organizations in you know, co-producing, I guess, adaptation planning and action, which is great. And I think, echoing something that Ashley said too, we were able to present some examples of urban Indigenous leaders working with big cities like Toronto and Calgary, which I think might not have many precedents elsewhere outside of Canada, but really shows some leadership and some really exciting avenues that are occurring right here, right now. So check out the chapter for more details there.
Thank you so much, Craig and Ashley. Fiona, before I hand it back to you, there was a question around, and of course I've lost it here, but I'm going to paraphrase. A question around, you know, quite clearly the assessment covered a lot of research areas, but the attendee was wondering whether there was any research gaps that perhaps future, oh, here we go, I found it. This person said it much more nicely than I did. What were some of the key gaps in knowledge that you identified from the research you did for this report? And do you have recommendations for filling those gaps? I think it's a really nice question to end our panel discussion on before handing it back to you.
Okay, thanks, Eva. So for the very first time within our assessment process, we asked all the authors to identify research needs and knowledge gaps. And I can't summarize them quickly here, especially with just simply a few minutes remaining, but I will encourage people to visit the chapters and find them on a chapter specific basis. We didn't summarize them for the synthesis, so I can't provide a quick answer, but they are there. In terms of addressing the knowledge gaps, I'm going to refer back to something Rory mentioned in the introduction, and that's the National Adaptation Strategy. And this report will be a key source of information to inform that strategy, and especially the knowledge gaps and emerging issues section. So it will really help inform the action going forward in Canada. Thanks.
Thanks, Fiona. We are just about out of time, so I will pass on my thanks to the attendees for your delightful questions. I think they kept our panelists and authors on their toes as to their work on the chapters, which will be going live in just 33 short minutes, so you can have a quick break and then access those. And also my thanks to the panelists for your thoughtful and thorough responses to the questions of the attendees. Thank you on behalf of moderating this discussion. It was a joy, and I'll hand it back to you, Fiona, I think, for some closing remarks.
There we go. Okay, so just a reminder, I know we've mentioned this frequently, but all the reports are available at changeandclimate.ca. And as Eva said, the National Issues Report will go live at exactly 1:30 p.m. today. So we encourage you to visit that. We also encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. I know some of you, or many of you, are there already, but through this newsletter, you'll get updates on the future reports. And we're also planning a series of chapter-specific and theme-specific webinars. So we've just managed to touch on these topics today, but these specific webinars will allow the authors to go into much more detail. So with that, I would like to once again thank the panelists for your excellent, fast-thinking answers, and Eva for doing an amazing job moderating, and all the participants on the line today. We're so happy you could join us. Thank you.